Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll start in just a moment. Still letting some folks come in from our waiting room here, so we'll wait until the flow of people stops, and then we'll get into our webinar. But thanks for joining us this evening. We appreciate it. You're going to see a poll pop up, and we would definitely appreciate it if you would fill that out. Let us know what part of the basin you're coming from. Seeing a lot of participation in that poll. Thanks, everybody. I think we'll probably leave it up for a little bit longer. And once enough folks have had a chance to participate in the poll, then we'll jump into our meeting. All right, I see we're up to 42 participants. So I think the number of folks coming in from the waiting room has slowed quite a bit. If you haven't had a chance to fill in the poll, maybe take a second or two to do that now. All right. Well, Casey, I think we've probably given folks enough of a chance to answer the poll. All right. So we've got good representation today, folks from Lewis County, Thurston County, a few even from Grace Harbor, and of course, a few folks from outside the basin, which is great. We welcome folks to just learn about what we're doing here. It's good to have you. So this is a webinar about the Skookumchuck Dam. We're going to be talking about the second phase of the work that we've done. And we'll get into that in just a second about talking about who we are and why we're talking about this today. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Casey Hart, who's going to walk you through some of the details about how we're going to handle the webinar today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining. Just a couple of Zoom reminders that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees will be muted. If you have any technical difficulties, please email me at chart@rawstrategic.com. And at the bottom of your screen, you can see that you can enable live transcripts or listen to Spanish interpretation with the interpretation settings. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. The box will be open for you to submit your questions during the entire meeting. You can upvote another person's question as well. Your questions can be submitted anonymously. Please note the raise hand feature is disabled. We will enable it at the very end for those who are on phones and cannot write questions in the box. And if you're on the phone, you can hit *9 to do that. Back to you, Nat.
Great, thank you, Casey. So once again, welcome. Just quickly, so you know who you're going to be hearing from tonight. I'm Nat Kale. I'm the principal planner for the Office of Chehalis Basin. I'll be taking the first half of the presentation. Mary Martz is a principal scientist with Anchor QEA, and she'll be taking the second half of the presentation. And the two of us have been managing this project for the last couple of years. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by explaining who I am, what the Chehalis Basin strategy is, and how the Skookumchuck Dam fits into that strategy. The Chehalis Basin strategy is a network of partners who are hard at work to make the Chehalis Basin a safe, healthy, and plentiful place to live for people, for fish, and for wildlife. The strategy is administered by the Office of Chehalis Basin, where I work, which is housed within the Washington State Department of Ecology. And the strategy is led by the Chehalis Basin Board, which has community leaders as well as representatives from state, local, and tribal governments. The strategy is supported and carried out by partners, including local nonprofits, governments, and residents. And we create resources and fund on-the-ground projects to restore habitats for aquatic species and to protect residents from increasingly dangerous flood damage. At the same time, we're planning for large-scale, long-term solutions so the basin continues to be a safe, healthy, and abundant place to live for generations to come. Next slide, please. Since 2012, state and local partners have invested nearly $100 million to fund more than 100 projects that benefit both people and aquatic life. These include projects like what you see in front of you, evacuation routes and early flood warning systems, flood protection for homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure, raised farm paths that safeguard the livestock and the equipment that farms need to operate, fish passage barrier corrections, which have opened up habitat for over 100 miles of streams for salmon and for steelhead, and more than 60 habitat restoration projects. And there are more. You can see more projects like these on our website at chehalisbasinstrategy.com. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. And if you have a chance to fill in this poll first, we would really appreciate it. We are very interested to know how familiar folks are with the Skookumchuck River and the Skookumchuck Dam and the work that we've been doing up to this point. So we'll leave that up for a few more seconds, give folks a chance to participate. I see most folks have had a chance to, but if you haven't, please go ahead and put a little vote in, and then we will show you the results of our poll so you can see where we're at. And it looks like we have some folks who are very familiar with the work we've been doing, but most of you are kind of in that somewhat familiar range. You've maybe heard something, but not very much. And then we do have a few who are not familiar at all, which is great. This is kind of where we were aiming our presentation. We expected folks to know a little bit, but if you don't know anything, don't worry. We should be able to fill you in. So this is our agenda for today. I'm going to start by providing an overview of the Skookumchuck Dam study, the history of it, what we've done so far, and the different phases that we've gone through. Then we're going to focus on the options that we looked at in phase 2. There are 5 of them. So the first one is, as is usually the case with a study like this, the no action alternative. What does the dam operate like right now? We also looked at an alternative where we would remove the dam. We modeled and studied that. We looked at an option where we maximized the flood damage reduction benefit of the dam, and another option where we maximized fish passage through the dam. And then the final option that we looked at was what we call this combined fish flood, where we tried to balance the benefits of flood damage reduction and fish benefits. And then at the end, we will have some time to answer questions. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by giving you all an overview of the Skookumchuck River Basin. For those of you who are very familiar with our project, this is going to be a review for you. For those who are less familiar, I find it super helpful to get yourself oriented. The Skookumchuck River is about 40 miles long. Approximately halfway down the river at River Mile 22 is the Skookumchuck Dam. Upstream of the Skookumchuck Dam, so behind the dam, is a reservoir, the Skookumchuck Dam Reservoir, which is about 4 miles long. Just downstream of the dam, there is a hatchery that's operated to provide coho and steelhead in the Skookumchuck River. As you go further downstream, the river, the Skookumchuck River, winds next to or through the town of Bucota. Downstream of that, there is an intake for the Centralia Steam Generation Plant. The Skookumchuck Dam was originally built to provide water for that Centralia Steam Generation Plant. And that plant has 2 turbines one of which went offline in 2020, and the other of which is planned to go offline in 2025. There are also two gauges that are worth keeping in mind. These are USGS river gauges, so they measure the flow of water at different points. One is upstream right by the dam, and the other is just downstream of that intake for the steam generation plant. Next slide, please. This is a zoom in on the dam itself, the Skookumchuck Dam. And again, this is to give you a better understanding of how the dam operates, which I think will help when you understand the options we look at. So the dam is in brown there. You can see the reservoir on the right, the dam on the left, and then the river sort of winding past the dam and exiting our screen at the upper left. There's a spillway where when water gets high enough in the reservoir, it automatically spills over and into the river, and that's in the bottom center of this image. And then cut into the side of that spillway, there's what we refer to as the fish sluice. So this is a 4 foot by 4 foot opening about 12 feet down in the spillway that can be manually operated from the top of the dam. It can be opened or closed with a slide. It was originally designed to facilitate the passage of fish downstream through the Skookumchuck Dam. And then there are a couple of other elements that you can see here as well. There's an adult fish collection facility down at the base of the dam. Overhead shots like this make it a little difficult to pick out, but there's a very steep slope from the crest of the dam down to where that fish collection facility is. So the fish collection facility is where the land starts to level out. And that's where steelhead and coho are collected. And then there's a steelhead rearing pond there as well. Next slide, please. This is a schematic of how water can make its way through the dam. So on the left, you'll see we've got labeled intake 1, 2, and 3, and then a line that connects those with 3 outputs: a hatchery, a turbine, and downstream. What this means is that on the reservoir side, there is a pipe that has intakes at 3 different elevations in the reservoir, and water can come into that pipe from any of those 3 points or all 3. As it makes its way through the pipe, it can then be diverted to one of 3 different locations. It can go to the hatchery that was built at the same time as the dam to offset some of the fish loss that was anticipated to happen with dam construction. It can be diverted to a turbine, which was built after the dam was constructed to generate hydropower, and that turbine generates about, or has a capacity of about 1 megawatt. And then it can also simply go straight downstream, right into the river. On the right, you'll see sort of a straight line that says spillway and fish sluice, and that goes right to downstream. And that's because any water that goes through the spillway or the fish sluice that we talked about in the last slide just goes right to the river. It goes right downstream. So that's how water can make its way through the dam. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about the Skookumchuck Dam, there are really 3 main things that we need to keep in mind, and they're flooding, water supply, and fish. And what I say about, the reason I say that is, these are sort of the 3 key pieces that the dam influences. On the flood side, the dam was not built to reduce flooding on the Skookumchuck River, but it does, under some circumstances, in some storm events, provide flood reduction. That happened to be the case, for example, in 2009, which without the dam would have been the largest flooding on the Skookumchuck River. Then there's the fish on the right. So the dam, as with most dams, directly blocks migration of anadromous fish upstream of the Skookumchuck River. We mentioned the collection facility downstream of the dam. There is some active collection and transport of fish upstream of the dam. It's a small number of steelhead that are transported by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that happens some years, but not others. Coho and Chinook, which are present and fairly common in the Skookumchuck River are not transported upstream of the dam at present. And then there's the question of water supply. And that is what the dam was created to do. It was created to supply water, a pretty significant amount of water, for that Centralia steam generation plant that we talked about. What has happened in the last few years is that the current owner of the dam, TransAlta, has converted their water right from one that's just for that steam generation plant into what's called a water bank. And what that water bank does is it allows other water users to apply to that bank to create new uses of water and offset those new uses with the bank. So the bank essentially allows them to take what used to be water that was dedicated for that steam generation facility and sell it to other folks to use for other purposes, such as municipal water supplies or industrial water supplies. So all three of those things are really important when we think about what the dam does and what it could do in the future. Next slide, please. I mentioned at the beginning the 5 options that we looked at. So to list those again, we started, as always, with the current dam operations. No action. How is the dam presently run? What are the effects of that dam as presently run on flooding, on water supply, and on fish? Then we looked at a dam removal option, and I always have to caveat this one a little bit. So dam removal is something that we modeled and studied the impact, but I need to make it very clear that TransAlta, who owns and operates the Skookumchuck Dam, has made it plain that they are not in favor of removing the dam. So this has been, in some ways, more of a hypothetical that we've looked at in order to compare to other options. The third option that we looked at was the flood storage only option. So this was, how could we modify the dam in order to maximize the benefit for those living downstream in terms of flood damage? Or in other words, how could we use the dam to reduce flooding as much as possible? The fourth option is a fish passage only option. So that says, setting aside everything else, flood damage, what have you, how could we operate the dam to move fish upstream and downstream the best we possibly could? How can we make this dam maximize its ability to allow fish to use the Skookumchuck River? And then the final option we looked at is a combined fish flood option. So in this case, what we did was look at how we could balance those benefits to downstream folks in Bucota, Centralia, and along the river to reduce their risk of flooding, while at the same time making the dam as beneficial as possible for fish, or minimizing the impact of the dam on fish. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through each of those options in turn, and we're going to start with current operations, because that will give you a base understanding of what it is that this dam does and how it operates. So a few key points for you to know about the dam. We've already gone over a few of them. The dam was built to supply water for the steam generation plant. The amount of water in that water right is 51.6 cubic feet per second. Now, I want to put that in perspective because I know that number doesn't mean a lot to some folks who don't work with water all the time. In late summer, without the dam, it would be expected that the Skookumchuck River would commonly flow at about 35 cubic feet per second, or a little bit more. That would be the minimum flow, late summer, very dry conditions. So the amount of water supplied by the dam is over and above even the amount of water that you would expect to find in the river under dry conditions. On the other hand, during flood events, the Skookumchuck River can get up to almost 10,000 CFS. So hopefully that puts that number in perspective. It's also worth remembering that the water intake is downstream of Bucota. So if you recall that map that we had at the beginning, there's a reach between the dam and the water intake where flow is higher because water is being sent from the dam to the intake. And then downstream of the intake, the water is lower again because it's been removed in order to be used at the steam generation facility. Second point, there is plenty of flow in winter. The reservoir holds water to supply flows in late spring throughout fall. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. It's really those spring, summer, fall conditions that we're worried about. Third point is the dam has provided flood control in some years and not others. We'll come back to this a little bit, but that's an essential point. There are some flood events in which the river essentially operates as if the dam isn't there, and there's water that goes downstream and there's a lot of it. There are other years in which the reservoir happens to be low and it holds a lot of water. Fourth point, the dam blocks fish passage. And I think this is true, of course, of most dams. There is a fish collection facility, and some adult steelhead are passed upstream in some years. And we already talked about the downstream fish sluice for juveniles. So the dam does block fish passage with a little bit of a caveat there. There is a little bit of upstream and downstream movement of fish. Next slide, please. This, I think, really highlights that point we made about how the dam sometimes does and sometimes does not reduce downstream flooding. So I'm going to explain this chart a little bit because I know it's maybe not immediately intuitive. On the left, you'll see that we're measuring peak flows. So this is the highest amount of water that was discharged in a particular event. And you'll see our scale goes all the way up to 14,000 cubic feet per second. That's a lot of water. That's a great deal of water going through. Now you'll see that we've got two bars. So the blue is observed and the orange is modeled conditions. We created a model of the reservoir, and we ran water through that computer model to see what we would see in terms of downstream flows. And what you see is that in 1990 and in 2022 in January, we saw very good correlation between what was observed in the river and what we got from our model. But we see big differences in 2007 and 2009 and March of 2022, where we see a lot more water under the modeled flow than under the observed flow. And the reason for that is there's some leeway in how TransAlta is allowed to operate the dam. And there's a difference between the way that it was actually operated and the by the book operation of the dam. And this incorporates some things like, for example, TransAlta is required by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to occasionally draw down the reservoir and allow inspections. When things like that happen, you end up with more capacity in the reservoir than you would otherwise have expected. And then we could model in our computer model. And so then what you see is this big difference between what we would have expected to see downstream, where there would have been a lot of water because it would have quickly overwhelmed the capacity in the reservoir and gone downstream, versus what we actually saw downstream, where there was much more capacity in the reservoir than expected, and it held the water back. So really the point of this graph is sometimes that dam holds back quite a bit more water than you would expect. Next slide, please. Continuing with the theme of how the dam is currently operated, this is really sort of how dams generally work. Dams like the Skookumchuck Dam. In the fall, we see the reservoir rise. The water in the reservoir goes up. And we see it go up to about the spillway and sort of bounce along there. In this past week, for instance, it's been right at that spillway elevation, and we've seen some spill over the spillway. So that happens most of the winter. When you hit a dry spell, it'll drop a little, and then it'll rain and it'll go back up. In the spring, as things start to dry off, you see that reservoir drop and start to drop further. And there's a really key point there where you'll notice sometime in spring or summer, it drops below that fish sluice. And what happens at that point is there's no way for juvenile fish to safely go downstream through the Skookumchuck Dam. So that's a key cutoff point. When the water drops below that fish sluice, juvenile fish can no longer safely make their way downstream. So keep that in mind when we come to some future options. In the summer, of course, we see the reservoir continue to drop because it's dry and the dam is discharging in order to keep that water right that we talked about earlier, make sure that that water right is being fulfilled downstream. And then in the fall, we see the pattern repeat, and as the rains come, it fills back up. Next slide, please. And indeed, there it is, initial rains in the fall. Next, please. So that's the current operations. That's how the dam is currently operated. The first option we looked at was dam removal. And again, remember my caveat, this is not an option that's supported by TransAlta, who is the current owner of the dam. So we looked at this in order to compare some of the other options that are out there. So a couple of important points about this. Dam removal can be full or partial removal. To be clear, in partial removal, you still have a free-flowing stream through where the dam used to be, but instead of removing all of the material that was holding back the reservoir, you only remove part of it. So the trade-off with a partial removal is you have a fairly narrow point where the stream is going through the dam, and then these steep slopes that go back up. Whereas with a full removal, you're going back to the natural conditions where you've got this full width of the stream or river that it can move in. Second point, dam removal allows free flows of water and wood and sediment, and it allows access for fish to the upper watershed. There are a lot of processes that are important for river health. Removing a dam helps to restore those processes. Third point, dam removal would change flows by not storing any floodwater or by releasing flow in the summer and fall. That really goes back to what we were just talking about, how some of those flows are held back by the reservoir. If there's no dam, no flows are being held back. Fourth point is that the dam removal option could increase peak flood flows by about 10% as modeled, but it would have doubled the actual 2009 flood flow because the reservoir was fairly empty at that time. So this kind of goes to how tricky it is to build a computer model that really accurately describes what has happened in the Skookumchuck Dam, because there are decisions that people are making in the operation of the dam, and those are difficult to put into a computer model and create as rules. And then the last point we want to make here is just to talk a little bit about the cost. The actual removal of the dam, we estimate, very high level, broad estimate, to be about $25 to $35 million. The water right that is associated with the dam, that is in the reservoir, is approximately $80 million. If you were to remove the dam and there were no way to provide that water to the folks who have the right to it, you would have to buy out that water right. So that $80 million could be an additional cost on top of the actual construction costs for removing the dam. Next slide, please. This is just a description that will hopefully help you understand a little bit how the water rights needs work. Very simply, that 30 to 35 CFS, as I said a little bit earlier in the presentation, is what we would expect for flows with no dam. That's sort of the natural conditions. And then at 85, that's about the minimum discharge that you would need in the Skookumchuck River in order to meet the minimum needs for the existing water rights. So there's a pretty big delta between the natural conditions and the conditions that meet the water right needs. Next slide, please. And then the last one thing to talk about, of course, with dam removal is how much would it benefit fish? This is another area where we created a computer model, a model called EDT, which is commonly used. And I believe that's ecosystem design and treatment. And we use that model in order to get us an understanding of what the abundance of fish would be under different scenarios. You'll notice that we have these grouped under existing climate and late climate. So we did look at a climate change scenario and estimated what impact that would have, in addition to looking at the impact of the operations, which you can see along the bottom. So we have current operations, the way the dam is currently run, and then dam removal, which is the option we're talking about right now. And what you see is that under the dam removal option, all of the bars go up, right? We expect an increase in fish abundance under either existing climate or late century climate conditions for a dam removal scenario. And if you look at that blue bar, which represents steelhead, you'll see that in all four of these little groups, that bar rises hugely. So there's a really big improvement for steelhead. But all of the fish see a lift, including spring run Chinook salmon and fall run Chinook salmon, which are in that gray and that light yellow bar. Next slide, please. So the third option is the flood storage only option. Now in this option, what we would do is leave the dam in place. This is not the dam removal option. This is the dam remains in place. And we would attempt to physically modify the dam and change the operations of the dam to minimize downstream flooding impacts. So the biggest physical change that we would do in order to operate the dam in this way is to increase the discharge capacity. If you recall earlier, I had a diagram with the pipes that showed how water flows through the dam. At present, the maximum capacity of those pipes is about 250 cubic feet per second. And we'll come back to what that means, but you can see the difference there. We're proposing to increase the capacity to flow water downstream through the dam to 2,000 cubic feet per second. So almost 10 times as much discharge through the dam. The other thing that we would do is try to maintain about 20,000 acre feet of storage in the reservoir during that wet season, October 1st to April 30th. And what that does is give you additional capacity in the dam for when the waters come. So the combination of these two things is when you see a storm on the horizon, number one, you're starting with less water in the dam than if it were all the way up at the spillway, which, if you recall, is essentially how it works under current conditions. In the winter, the water comes up to the spillway and mostly stays there. So we would try to hold that water level lower. And in addition, we have this additional discharge capacity of 2,000 cubic feet per second. So when we see a storm event coming for a couple of days ahead of time, we can discharge from the dam at 2,000 cubic feet per second and further lower that reservoir, creating a lot of capacity behind the dam that can then hold that water that would otherwise go downstream and flood out Bucota, Centralia, and anybody living along the river. Now, this kind of approach could affect water rights because the focus would be on flood storage and the reservoir wouldn't fill in dry years. So if we keep that reservoir low, if we get a particularly dry year, we might not have enough water to bring it back up. And then when we get to the end of the dry season, there might simply not be enough water in the reservoir in order to fulfill those water right needs downstream. Now, what we did see is that by doing this, by operating the dam in this way, we could reduce peak floods by nearly 60%. So that's a huge reduction in the peak flows. And the event that we looked at for that was the 2009 flood, which is really sort of the critical event for the Skookumchuck, at least in recent history. Remember, there was a big difference between what we had modeled and what we actually saw in the stream. And in 2009, that was a very significant difference where the existing dam did a lot to reduce flooding downstream. Even so, we still saw about a 20% reduction in actual discharge. So if we operated the dam in this way, we think that we would have actually seen peak flows 20% lower than they were even observed during that still highly mitigated or protected event in 2009. This option, again, a very high level cost estimate, very rough number, about $42 million. And that does not include any mitigation that might be required as a part of it. Next slide, please. I just wanted to include this slide to get you a feel for why we felt such significant physical modifications to the dam would be necessary to get that flood benefit. At present, if you're discharging at full capacity from the dam through the pipes that currently exist, not the ones we proposed for this flood alternative, but the ones that currently exist, it takes 2 full months to empty the reservoir. And that's assuming no new water is coming in. So you can see how you would need to increase the capacity of discharge through the dam in order to be able to more actively regulate the height of that reservoir. Next slide, please. And this is how we would change, we are proposing, I shouldn't say proposing, how this option would change the reservoir elevation. So instead of it simply going up in the fall, we would actually reduce the elevation of the reservoir in the fall, and we would keep it low in the winter. Then what we would try to do is bring it up again in the spring. And then it would be filling up so that we have that water in summer and fall for those conditions, for those water rights. One more, Casey. Thank you. The other thing this would do is start to bring the water level in the reservoir up above that key point that we talked about, which is the fish sluice. Once you get above that key point, young fish can migrate downstream. As it happens, young fish do migrate downstream right at this period. Chinooks start earlier in January, coho and steelhead start a little bit later. So it's easier to bring that water level up and meet the needs for coho and steelhead than it is for Chinook. But either way, when you bring that water level up above the fish sluice, that's when the juvenile fish have an opportunity to migrate downstream and out to the ocean. Next slide, please. And this is an estimate of the impacts this option would have on fish. And you'll see that since this is focused on flooding and not fish, what we see is a reduction. So that's the group, the second group from the left and the fourth group from the left. You see that we see the number of fish go down under these options. We don't actually see a big change for steelhead, but we do see some changes for especially Chinook, and they are the most affected by this flood-only option. Next slide, please. This is a description of how this would affect the extent of flooding. There's 4 colors on here, but I think there are 2 that are really important to pick out. The current operations are in blue. So you can see that under a 100-year flood, that's the fairly big flood that we use as a standard, we see quite an extent of flooding, all the way from the dam, all the way down into Centralia. The flood-only option is in that tan color. And you can see that in some places, it very much restricts how much flooding happens. It's significantly reduced from the current conditions. Next slide, please. But that, of course, was under the current climate conditions. In future climate conditions, we anticipate a lot more rainfall, so a lot more flooding. And that means that even under our flood storage option, where we're trying to hold back more water, with a 100-year future event, we see a lot closer to the same extent of flooding, sort of that valley wall to valley wall type flooding, even when we're holding back a lot of water. But the big difference that we do see from that flood storage option is a reduction in the number of structures that have really deep inundation. So houses that would otherwise have had 3 or more feet of water in them, now it goes down to maybe 1 foot of water, which is a lot easier to manage with, say, sandbags or something like that. So despite the fact that you're seeing a similar extent of flooding in future climate change conditions with this flood storage option, you're still seeing a benefit in reducing the height of the water in many places. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk about the last two options.
Thanks, Nat. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the fish passage only option first. So the purpose of this was really to try to maximize downstream passage of fish through the dam. And what that requires is trying to keep the reservoir as full as possible for as long as possible, which is actually quite similar to how the dam is currently operated, because it's intended to be kept as full as possible for as long as possible for water supply purposes. But this would really focus on fish passage. So it's the least likely to affect water rights because it's so similar to current operations. The reservoir is full, so there's plenty of water to discharge for both fish and for people. And there's very little difference in flooding because it's very similar to current operations as well. And to improve fish passage through the existing fish sluice is a relatively lower cost option, about $8 million, because what you would need to do is build a new sluice, but it's a relatively small area, small piece, and small passageway through the dam. Next slide. So here's a similar graph as you've seen for the other options. And what's different on this fish passage one is that we actually have two fish passage columns. So the left three columns is current operations, and then fish passage with 33% and 90% of fish passage. And the reason for that is currently about 10% of the adult steelhead that are collected downstream of the dam are passed upstream. If we wanted to focus on fish passage, we could potentially increase a lot more passage of fish. And so we looked at sort of a low level of passage of steelhead and other species, about 33% versus a 90% or nearing 100%. And this is shows similar benefits for coho, fall and spring Chinook, which are in the orange, gray, and light yellow columns, that you would see some benefits, but maybe not huge benefits, mostly for coho. But for steelhead, you would see quite good benefits, nearly doubling over current operations for the 33% option, and nearly 4 times for the fish passage only option with 90%. In late century, just like you'd seen in the other alternatives, you see an overall decline of fish generally, but you still see benefits with fish passage only, primarily for steelhead and coho, and not much difference for spring and fall Chinook. And the reason for the limited benefits to spring and fall Chinook is that the reservoir occupies about 4 miles of habitat, as Nat mentioned in the beginning. And those 4 miles were the best habitat for Chinook. They were sort of the main river valley floodplain miles. And upstream of that point, the river becomes much steeper and narrower and is less suitable for Chinook spawning. So that's why you see more benefits to steelhead and coho with the reservoir in place. Next slide. And then the last alternative is this combined fish flood alternative. So trying to figure out, can you optimize for both purposes at the same time? And so it essentially includes the same structural components that were in the flood storage only option, the increased discharge capacity, and the fish passage only options and improved fish sluice. And the intent would be to maintain flood storage over a little bit shorter period than with flood storage only, from October 1 to at least January 1, which would encompass sort of the worst part of the season for floods. But floods still can happen after January 1st. But there would be an intent to try to refill the reservoir by March 15, which is about the time that downstream migration for particularly coho and steelhead would start. And this option also included in the modeling, we built-in capacity to like actively predict when floods are coming. That could also happen under the flood storage option, but wasn't modeled. But if you knew that a flood was coming and you had about 3 days warning, you could actively let flow out of the reservoir and draw it down to provide that flood storage before the flood actually came. And so you could keep the reservoir a little bit higher, which would give you more confidence that you could refill the reservoir if there wasn't a flood coming. And this option could reduce peak floods by nearly 70%. If, for example, we had looked at the 2009 flood, which was about the highest flood on record as modeled. But as Nat had mentioned for the flood storage option, because the 2009 flood was held back by the nearly empty reservoir, the actual reduction that you might see under this alternative compared to what you observed in 2009 was about 40% reduction in flooding, but that's still quite significant. This option would have a low but slightly lower risk of effects on water rights compared to the flood storage option, because refilling the reservoir is a priority because you are trying to also enhance fish passage. But there certainly could be dry years when it's not possible to balance flood storage and fish very well and you don't refill the reservoir fully. And the cost for this basically includes the elements for both the flood storage and fish passage. So it's about $50 million for construction. Next slide. The fish benefits for this option are not quite as good as you would get with the fish passage only, but they're still quite substantial, particularly for steelhead and coho once again. And as I mentioned, that the reservoir occupies the spawning habitat, the best spawning habitat for Chinook. This option also doesn't pass Chinook downstream as well as coho and steelhead, because Chinook have a very long migratory period, as Nat had mentioned, starting as early as January 1st and extending well into the summer, whereas coho and steelhead juveniles primarily migrate out during a shorter window from about March 15 to June 15. And so this option is more effective at passing them downstream. So you see much better benefits for both steelhead and coho. Next slide. And so getting back to the point that Nat made when we were looking at the floodplain figures, this gets at sort of the issue about the water depth downstream. And so this is showing all of the alternatives and the number of structures that are flooded in a 100-year flood for both existing and late century climate. And the teal bars on the left of each of these options are the total number of structures. And then that total is broken into 3 depth categories. And the light teal is 0 to 1 foot of flooding, which doesn't typically cause a lot of damage to people in homes or businesses. And then the gray, which is 1 to 3 feet, which can start to cause substantial damage. And then the pinkish color is greater than 3 feet depth. And so for both the flood storage only and the combined fish flood options under existing climate significantly reduce the number of total structures flooded, as well as particularly the number of structures flooded greater than 3 feet in depth. The dam removal option does not have much increase in number of structures flooded compared to current operations and fish passage only, which have nearly the identical thing. But there would be an increase in some structures flooded greater than 3 feet in depth. In the late century, the total number of structures gets more similar across all the alternatives, as Nat had showed with that other figure, because most of the valley is flooded under all options. But there's still significant benefit, particularly for flood storage and combined fish flood, especially in reducing the depth of flooding to be less than 3 feet. Next slide. And so here's a table that's kind of side by side compares all of these alternatives together. And so the key things to note are for fish passage only, you see quite good benefits for steelhead and coho, with low or limited benefits for spring Chinook and fall Chinook. There's not much change with flood effects for fish passage only because it's very similar to the current operations, but there is a small but increased risk of water right curtailments in drought years when you don't fill the reservoir. And it's a relatively low cost option. For the flood storage only, you see not much effect or either benefit or negative effect on steelhead, but you do see negative effects for all the other fish species. But you get substantial reductions in flood extent and depth, although less benefits in late century. There is also small but increased risk of water right curtailments in drought years, and this is more of a moderate cost alternative at 42 million. The combined fish flood alternative provides substantial benefits for steelhead and coho, but really no benefits for spring and fall Chinook and slight negative effects because of downstream effects. When you're managing for flood storage, you reduce the amount of habitat that is available downstream of the dam. There's also substantial benefits and in reduction in flood extent and depth, which are also lessened in late century. And there's still a small but increased risk of water right curtailments for this option. And it's one of the more expensive options at $50 million. And then dam removal has substantial benefits to all the fish species, particularly steelhead, but quite beneficial to all species. And there are relatively small increases in flood extent and depths, although there are increases. And there's a much higher risk of water right curtailments in drought years. And this is the most expensive alternative if you include the water rights compensation. From the construction standpoint, it's moderate, but with the water rights compensation, it's the highest. Next slide. And so just to wrap up here, some of the comments and input we've heard from stakeholders and citizens so far is that there's a lot of folks both within and without the basin who really value the fish species and would love to see them benefit from whatever action is taken in the future. And then also hearing pretty strongly from the communities of both Bucota and Centralia that any increases in downstream flooding would be substantial and a substantial hardship for them. And then farmers and other irrigators that rely on water rights from the Skookumchuck just value those water rights and need them and rely on them for their business and livelihood. And then just of note, the Skookumchuck is a very important river for spring Chinook within the Chehalis Basin and generally within the entire Pacific Northwest. It is one of the strongholds and it's very valuable run that is quite unique. Next slide. So the next steps for the board is they are not necessarily selecting an option and moving forward with one at this time. There's still a lot of questions and maybe some potential additional alternatives that could be studied, such as off-channel storage that could potentially store water to supply water rights, but would not actually have to be behind a dam and within a reservoir in the channel. It could be off-channel. And then looking at options of piping water supply to different locations so that you could maintain more natural flows in the river and pipe water to different locations. And there's quite a few questions that this phase 2 analysis has led to. You know, you can answer some questions, but it leads to more. And there's still not great data on the upstream habitat quality and quantity. There's some access restrictions up there. And there's a number of fisheries studies that have never been conducted since the dam was built on, you know, are there potential predators in the reservoir and fish survival through the existing fish sluice. So there's some other questions that could be answered about fish. And then whatever happens and whatever alternatives considered in the future, water rights is a very big piece of this puzzle. And so a much more detailed and in-depth look at specific water rights and when they are used could be valuable to this process. So next slide. So with that, I think we will turn it over to questions, and we will take it from there.
Thank you, Nat and Mary. We have a couple questions going on. Let's see. So one question is, does the late century climate modeling consider potential water quantity impacts? If so, what data set and or methodology for estimating water quantity impacts from climate was used?
I can give a summary and then hand it to Mary for details, maybe. The short answer is yes. It certainly did include water quantity impacts. There has been a lot of work in the Chehalis Basin to look at late century climate conditions. And that work is based on what's called downscaled climate modeling done by the UW's Climate Impacts Group. And there have been a number of scenarios that have been done in the basin. Mary, maybe you have some more details about, the scenarios that were used for this.
Yeah, so maybe a short answer is that the downscaled climate modeling and predictions that have been used and are being continuously updated for the Chehalis Basin show about a 60% increase in precipitation in the Skookumchuck Basin. And so that increase in precipitation was the basis for then calculating what the potential river flows might be, and used in the modeling to understand the floodplain extent and how much water could both come into the reservoir and how much would go out based on future climate.
Thank you. All right. Another question is, does the modeled flooding effects for all the options take into account the current and future habitat and floodplain restoration projects?
The flood modeling does not, but the fish benefit evaluation did take into account the habitat restoration that has currently occurred or has been proposed as part of the Chehalis Basin strategy. There's, and by proposed, I mean there's actually a sponsor who has come forward and requested funding, and that project is currently in design. So it does not include the full aquatic species restoration plan components that are that have been identified, because they're not necessarily ready to implement and well defined at this point in time.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have, do the 4 climate projections of the fish benefits / harms consider whether there are any reductions in in-stream flows protected by the in-stream flow rule after water is used to fulfill higher priority water rights?
Yes, the fish benefit modeling did take into account the fact that there are minimum flows established for the Skookumchuck River, and the lowest minimum flow is about 35 CFS in August and September. That's the required minimum flow as measured in Bucota. So the fish modeling did account for minimum flows, but with climate change, it also accounted for the fact that flows would become lower typically across the board, but it was not so detailed as to understand like what water rights could be exercised and could not be exercised. But generally that minimum flows would be met as feasible.
And maybe worth adding that one of our planned or hoped for future analyses is to look in greater detail at water rights and understand better, not just the TransAlta water right, but the other water rights throughout the Skookumchuck.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we have, how is the water right of 87 CFS established for a stream that has natural flow of about 35 CFS, where historic in-stream flows higher than natural flows would be today? And then the second part of that question, the third part, were the rights for 87 CFS established with dam construction?
That is a great question. I'm going to answer the second part first. Yes, the rights were established with dam construction. That was what the dam was constructed to do, was to create that water right and supply that water. One clarification though, the water right is 51.6 cubic feet per second. And perhaps I should have modified that graphic. That 87 that you saw, that's the combined in-stream flow and the water right. So it's the minimum total amount of water that we want to see in the stream. And then your question about, how could you have that 85 from sort of the natural flow? So the way that it works is the natural flow that we thought of hasn't really changed. We estimate that it's pretty similar now to what it would have been when the dam was created and before that. So about 35 cubic feet per second at a minimum under very dry conditions in the summer. But what the dam did was create this pool, this reservoir that allowed them to augment the flow downstream of the dam. So when you put together the augmented flow from the dam with the natural flow that's in the stream, the 35 CFS, that's where you see those higher numbers in like the 80 to 90 CFS range.
Great, thank you.
I'll add just one more thing. There are additional water rights along the Skookumchuck for other purposes, irrigation. The city of Bucota also has water rights. And so most of those water rights, but not all, were pre-existing to the pre-dam, but not all of them are. And so water rights that are junior and were after the dam was created and are not part of TransAlta's water right can become curtailed in dry years for certain. If you're not meeting in-stream flows, those water rights will be curtailed.
Great, thank you. And we're about at time, but one more question to end it off tonight. What are the assumptions regarding future climate change effects on precipitation, flow, and temperatures?
That's a pretty big question. And I think we might have to refer you to our phase 2 report, which has a lot of detail about how the modeling was done, the assumptions that were made. The report itself has some of that, and then we have appendices that provide a lot of the technical detail. Mary, I don't know if you can give a quick summary answer to that, or if we really just have to refer folks to the report.
Yeah, just as a quick summary, I had mentioned the 60% increase in precipitation, and then there's also a reduction in low flows, and I can't remember the percentage offhand, but it's somewhere in the 10 to 25% reduction in low flows. And then there were also some information. There's a thermalscape model that has been developed for the Chehalis Basin that looks at changes in temperatures in late century. And so that information as well was incorporated into the fish modeling, not into the hydraulic modeling, which was mostly focused on flows.
Great, thank you so much, Nat and Mary.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I wanted to wrap this up by saying, I know we weren't able to get to quite all of the questions today. If you do have questions, there's been a lot of contact information posted in the chat. Feel free to use our website to send in a comment or a question. And we always try to get responses out to folks as quickly as possible. And if you go on our website, you can also see any other webinars that we might be having coming up. I believe we have one about the Aquatic Species Restoration Plan coming up fairly soon. And all the information about our public meetings, such as our board meetings, are also on the website. And we always love to have folks from the public attend those. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate your attendance and hope to see you again in future webinars. Have a good evening.
Thank you.